Hi, you're listening to Pop-Up Podcasting. We make podcasting easy, so stick around for tips, tricks, and a behind-the-scenes look at the podcast industry. Hey, I'm Lisa, and in this episode, JP, Will, Richard, and I define narrative-style podcasting. Things to think about if you're considering doing one, and our thoughts on the Val Kilmer documentary on Prime Video. When I think of narrative-style podcasts, I think of CBC, or something even more story-driven like This American Life, or Serial, or the Canadian show that I think is similar to Serial called Someone Knows Something. What do you think about elements that you expect to hear when you listen to a podcast like that?
For me, it's the hook. I expect a lot of the ones I listen to are sort of in that, can be in that sort of Serial vein and stuff where there is sort of a mystery to be uncovered. So I usually think early on you're going to get that hook, right? They're going to present the case and then tell you, one key detail why it could all fall apart, something like that, right? To get you interested. And because, usually these are longer episodes and they're all tied together, right? So they want to draw you in from the start. So I find that's usually the one that gets me, is something really interesting right off the jump. And then it gets me hooked for the series.
The thing that really defines it for me is that somebody has really carefully crafted this story from many parts in many cases and taken time to think about that narration script. And like Will said, what's the hook going to be? How are we going to weave this story together versus, a lot of the podcasts we do are interview style or panel discussions, and it's more of a question and answer format. And we're often editing and moving things around and taking things out. But overall, it's not necessarily one story being told from the start of the episode to the end of the episode. It's more about information sharing, and there can be stories in that, but it's not necessarily that highly produced format that we're kind of talking about today.
Okay. And you mentioned in there that it's not something we see a lot of in our business. Did you want to get into why either or you think that might be?
Sure. I feel like we're already getting into the it's the JP show, so I don't know if anybody else which is fine. I know a lot about podcasts.
Yeah, no, I mean it's I feel like the main reason is definitely going to be, for companies to invest in it. It's going to cost more money. There's a lot more involved. So they're going to have a bit more budget. I think that's probably the main reason.
Well, I think a lot of the times too, like if you're going to embark on doing a narrative style, like whether it's investigation, whatever the basis of it is, if you're going to do that style, like if you think about a lot of the clients we work with, what they're doing in the, say, like media space or audio space with us isn't like what they do. They're using it to supplement what they do, value added, something like that. These narrative style ones, a lot of the times they're coming from places where this is what they do is produce like audio or video, whatever it is. So a lot of that, the costs are higher and everything, but it's also being done in like they're doing it in-house, whereas they're not necessarily always, I would think, contracting it out to others to take care of. So I think that could play a factor in it as well.
I do think there's really cool opportunities for companies or organizations that don't necessarily do what you're talking about, like only strictly produce this kind of material, to add narrative style elements to their shows. Because sometimes we'll produce a show for someone and there's going to be a guest on there that tells a really, really interesting story, and the story can go on for a good 10 minutes. And then within that story, you can probably hear some elements that could be really easily added, as far as if they're telling a story about, let's say, immigration, and you can add just all of the Foley and all of the sound design involved from the weather change and the walking and just a cool, some really nice elements to make that story come to life as they're telling it. I think that is a cool opportunity for organizations to think of, but it's not something that is just on top of their mind or anything. It's like you said, they're not used to producing big things like that.
Yeah. And I think I should clarify that, we're not against highly produced narrative style podcasts. And if anybody listening to this wants us to make one, we generally be game to do that. And all of us have at least some experience with audio drama and sound design and storytelling in audio. And we love listening to that kind of podcast. But I think it is some of the things that you guys have been talking about, where it's a big swing usually, right? It's there's more to producing it. And there's more potential downside, I guess, where, you put a lot of time and money into producing this thing. A lot of these series that we're seeing lately are short run series. So for one thing, you're not getting that sort of continual exposure. It's this big event that you're going to promote. It's going to come out over 6 weeks across 6 episodes or whatever, and then it's over. And so it's really expensive to produce. And then you really want to put a lot of marketing muscle and money behind it in order for it to be a success. It's sort of like, it's like producing a Marvel movie versus like a radio interview.
Or an indie documentary.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I think that's a good point too, because let's say a company that hasn't done this before, or they haven't added any kind of narrative style elements to their shows, even if they have the idea that I want to do this, I want to add these elements, they're then going to become afraid of, okay, but we've never done this before. Our audience isn't expecting it. So what do we do? Do we just add it to a random episode? Do we start a brand new show, which means even more costs? How much marketing do we have to put in to this so that people actually know that this new series or this new episode is going to have these elements? So I think there is that fear from coming from an organization or a company that's never done it before. I think there is that like, okay, I want to do it, but is anyone going to know I'm doing it without me having to spend a lot of money?
Yeah, well, and there's ways of tiptoeing into it. I've done a couple of things like this in the past where, maybe the show is sort of a multi-format show where we have, Richard, you're working on a show about immigration, so I know you brought that up earlier. You have this, moving, immersive narrative about somebody's immigration story, but it's 5 minutes long. And then we have, a 20-minute interview after that unpacks it. So you're getting to this kind of like 25-minute episode length, but you're not putting, it doesn't have to be an hour long and all there is in the episode. Cause that,
absolutely,
some of these stories also like wouldn't, if you stretched it out to 45 minutes or 60 minutes, it's not going to have that hook to draw you through. It's not going to have, all the twists and turns you'd expect from that hour-long experience, but maybe you can make like a mini version. But I agree too, where like I've had those interviews where I listen to it and I think, oh, this is a story. I just want to hear like the pitter patter of the rain in the background and, some of those moody elements, but also like, I think that's a bit jarring to the audience if it just all of a sudden in the middle of an episode that's usually just a chat show.
Yeah, so I think you're right. I think the way that you mentioned, like, I think you brought something up there that's interesting, where maybe that could be how like the episode starts. Like you have your intro, and then you kind of have the first initial question, which might just be the host asking someone to tell a quick little story about their life or whatever the content of the show is. And then, like you said, that could be maybe 3 to 5 minutes. And that's where your production elements, that's where your narrative style elements come in to really sell that beautiful story. And then after that, they can all kind of fade away. And then it can dive into the interviewer then picking apart what we just heard and getting more information. So it's almost like a making of. Kind of, right? So you watch a movie, but then you watch the making of that movie, which is always my favorite kind of documentary. I love making ofs. So I think that would be really interesting to hear this beautiful story told in a really narrative style with all these beautiful elements. And then the interview questioning the person telling the story and just having really raw responses, no more elements, just like straight up interview at that point.
Hearing you say about the behind the scenes, this is a bit of an aside, but everyone should watch the Val Kilmer documentary.
I watched that.
Prime.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool. I liked it.
It was pretty cool.
Yeah. Val Kilmer, the actor, has been documenting his life forever.
Oh, wow.
And so he put together this show or this movie, and his son narrates it. And
Which was interesting because his son actually sounds a lot like him as like a younger guy.
Right. Yeah. It was a great choice.
Thanks for checking out Pop-Up Podcasting, podcasting made easy. If you're interested in learning more about podcasting or starting your own podcast, you can find us at popuppodcasting.ca, where you can download our free guide, Podcasting at Work.